In the dawn light of Hierakonpolis, the Nile shimmered red, not from the rising sun, but from the reflection of blood in shallow water. The papyrus reeds quivered as the breeze carried the scent of iron and clay. At the edge of the riverbank, men dragged the bodies of the defeated toward the waiting gaze of the falcon god carved in stone. In that moment, a man whose name was written in pictures, a catfish and a chisel, stood still, watching as his enemy's final breath dissolved into the cool morning air. History would know him as Narmer, but the name alone could never hold the weight of what he intended to do. His was the burden of uniting two lands that had warred for centuries, and his was the audacity to believe he could hold them together. Before the day the Nile ran red, Egypt was not one Egypt, but two. To the south, the narrow ribbon of the river wound through cliffs of stone and desert, the land of the white crown, throne of the vulture goddess Nekhbet. To the north, the river split into countless green fingers in the delta, under the red crown, where the cobra goddess Wadjet watched over her marshes. For generations, kings had risen in both lands, each claiming dominion, each resisting the other. Between them lay the dream and the danger of unity. Narmer was born into this divided world, heir to the throne of Thinis, heart of Upper Egypt. In a time when the south was hungry for the north's fertile lands and access to the sea, his earliest memories were not of peace but of processions, rows of spearmen, banners snapping in the wind, the deep pulse of drums that called men to war. The desert sun taught him endurance. The Nile taught him patience. He learned to ride the river's moods, to read its floods, to understand that a ruler, like the water, must know when to surge and when to hold back. His rise was not a single leap, but a slow, relentless climb. Rival princes in the south had to be brought into his orbit. Allies were courted with marriage and gifts. Rivals were crushed or absorbed. By the time Narmer claimed the white crown, he understood the land beneath his feet like a map etched into his bones. But the Delta was another world. Its people spoke differently, prayed differently, and looked south with suspicion. Uniting them would take more than swords. It would take a performance so monumental that even the gods would have to bear witness. The campaign began in the season when the floodwaters withdrew, leaving the earth rich and black. Narmer's army moved north along the river like a dark tide, barges laden with soldiers, archers, and standards bearing the falcon of Horus. At night, campfires flickered on the banks, their smoke rising into a sky pierced by stars. The Delta lords, caught between fear and pride, summoned their warriors. Skirmishes flared in the marshes, ambushes among reeds, sudden clashes on narrow channels. Narmer fought not only with force, but with symbols. Every captured banner was paraded before his men, every victory carved into ivory tags and polished stone. It was at one such battle near the edge of the papyrus swamps that the scene immortalized on the Narmer palette unfolded. The king, towering above his kneeling enemy, gripped the man's hair with one hand while raising a mace with the other. Behind him, a servant held his sandals. Before him, the falcon god Horus stood upon the bound figure of the Delta, pulling him toward the south. To those who saw it, this was no mere execution. It was the image of a god-king enforcing the cosmic order of Ma'at over the chaos of rebellion. The message was clear. Resistance was not just futile, it was blasphemy. Narmer understood that symbols could outlive men. The palette, carved from green schist, was not meant for use but for remembrance, its images a permanent witness to the unification. On its reverse, he appeared in the red crown, surveying rows of decapitated enemies, their heads placed neatly between their feet. In the center, two fantastical beasts with intertwined necks formed a circle, a knot of unity between Upper and Lower Egypt, controlled by handlers from both lands. At the bottom, a bull, symbol of royal strength, trampled a fallen foe and smashed the walls of a city. This was not just a record, it was propaganda in its most enduring form. Victory in the Delta was not the end, but the beginning of Narmer's greatest challenge. Conquest could be swift, governance was slow. The people of the north did not forget their autonomy overnight. Tribute had to be collected, temples restored, and local chiefs brought into the royal fold. Narmer traveled with his court between the ancient capitals, making himself visible, offering gifts to the gods of each region, and weaving a narrative in which he was not a conqueror, but the rightful lord of the two lands. The court at Hierakonpolis swelled with artisans and scribes, their work blending the traditions of both Upper and Lower Egypt. Pottery from the north bore the falcon of the south. Southern tombs were adorned with marshland motifs. Narmer encouraged such blending, not only as art, but as politics. The double crown he now wore was the most potent symbol of all, the union of Hedjit and Deshret into the Shent, a crown that demanded balance as much as it proclaimed dominance. Beyond Egypt's borders, Narmer cast his gaze toward the lands of Canaan. Trade routes stretched like veins into the Levant, carrying copper, timber, and exotic goods into Egypt's heart. Archaeological finds centuries later would reveal Narmer's name inscribed on jars and fragments in distant settlements, proof of his reach. These ventures were not mere commerce. They were political threads binding Egypt to a network that could bring both wealth and danger. Narmer's presence in Canaan served as a warning. Egypt's unity gave it the strength to project power far beyond its riverbanks. Yet the king was not blind to the fragility of his creation. The Nile, source of life, was also a capricious force. A poor flood could wither the harvest and spark unrest. Local rivalries, long suppressed, could erupt if the court appeared weak. Narmer invested in the religious and ceremonial life of the kingdom as much as in its armies. He presented himself not only as a warrior, but as the mediator between gods and men. In temple courtyards, he offered sacrifices beneath the gaze of Horus. In processions, he was the living embodiment of divine order. To his people, the stability of the cosmos itself seemed tied to the man who wore the double crown. In the royal workshops, stonemasons carved his likeness into mace heads, cylinder seals, and ceremonial objects. One such artifact, the Narmer mace head, depicted him enthroned, wearing the red crown, with attendants recording lists of captives and goods. Some scholars in later centuries would wonder if this scene marked a royal wedding to a northern princess, sealing the unity of the two lands through marriage. Whether or not the event happened as imagined, its portrayal reinforced the image of Narmer as both conqueror and unifier, a king whose power was sanctioned by tradition and ritual as much as by force. The unification of Egypt was more than the merging of crowns. It was the merging of identities, myths, and loyalties. Narmer's rule sought to fuse the vulture of Nekhbet and the cobra of Wadjet into a single emblem, to create a pantheon that could speak to both halves of the kingdom. In doing so, he laid the foundation for a state that would endure for millennia. But even as he tightened his grip on the kingdom, shadows lingered. Every victory carved in stone was also a reminder that it could be undone. One evening, as the floodwaters receded and the harvest season began, Narmer stood at the edge of the palace terrace in Memphis, the new city said to be his creation, rising on the border between Upper and Lower Egypt. From here, he could see both the narrow southern river and the wide northern delta, the symbolic meeting place of his two realms. The air smelled of wet earth and fresh-cut reeds. Somewhere in the distance, drums echoed from a village celebration. He knew that unity was a living thing, as fragile as a reed stem, and it would take every ounce of his will to keep it from snapping. The gods had given him this moment, but they had not promised him forever. This was the Egypt Narmer had forged, through blood, stone, and the relentless vision of a man who refused to accept division. And as the falcon of Horus wheeled overhead, the king who bore the catfish and chisel knew that the story of his reign had only just begun. The months after the final subjugation of the Delta were marked not by silence, but by a new rhythm, one of construction, administration, and the slow weaving of disparate lands into a single tapestry. The war banners were furled and stored in the armories, their fabric still smelling of smoke and marsh water. In their place, Narmer ordered the raising of new standards, each one bearing the combined emblems of Upper and Lower Egypt. The vulture and the cobra, poised together above the Serek that held his name. To the people, this image was more than decoration. It was a promise, and perhaps a warning, that the unity forged in battle would now be guarded in peace. In Memphis, the city whose foundation stones were still fresh in mud and reed mortar, the streets began to take shape under Narmer's vision. The location was no accident. Standing at the seam between the southern valley and the northern delta, Memphis was both a symbol and a practical choice, controlling trade and communication in every direction. Merchants from Canaan, Nubia, and distant lands came bearing goods: copper from Sinai, cedar from Lebanon, gold from the deserts to the south. The palace workshops hummed with activity, producing fine linen, carved ivory combs, and stone vessels so smooth they reflected the lamplight like water. Narmer moved between Memphis and Hierakonpolis, his presence a constant reminder of the bond between the two crowns. Everywhere he traveled, he was met with ritual: priests offering incense, musicians playing the deep, throbbing rhythms of sistrum and drum, children scattering lotus petals at his feet. Yet beneath the surface of celebration lay the hum of uncertainty. The people of the north still whispered the names of their old rulers. Some chiefs resented the tribute they now paid. Narmer understood the necessity of patience, but also the danger of leniency. He tightened the network of officials loyal to his court, placing them in key towns to oversee harvests, levy taxes, and maintain the peace. The Nile itself became his greatest ally. Each year, its floodwaters renewed the soil, and each year, Narmer's court orchestrated grand ceremonies to thank the gods for their gift. These festivals served not only to honor the divine, but to reinforce the image of the pharaoh as the mediator between heaven and earth. During the ceremonies, Narmer would stand before the sacred bark of Horus, its gilded prow catching the sunlight, and receive the blessings of priests who spoke as the voices of the gods. To the gathered crowds, words sure. This was the living proof that the man before them was no mere mortal ruler. He was the pivot upon which the fate of the two lands turned. Still, Narmer was too shrewd to rely solely on divine imagery. He recognized that trade and diplomacy could cement alliances where armies could not. Expeditions were sent to the Sinai to secure valuable turquoise and copper mines. In the south, relations with Nubia were cultivated through both gifts and calculated shows of strength. The exchange of goods, grain, gold, cattle, and crafted wares, flowed in both directions, binding Egypt into a wider world. Archaeological echoes of this age would later be found in far-off settlements, where fragments of pottery bearing Narmer's Serek lay buried beneath centuries of dust. Yet for all his achievements, Narmer could not escape the knowledge that unity was a delicate balance, one that demanded constant attention. Reports reached him of small uprising in the farthest marshes of the Delta, where old loyalties died hard. In these cases, he acted swiftly. Detachments of soldiers, led by trusted commanders, descended upon the rebellious villages, dismantling their fortifications and redistributing their lands. The message was unambiguous. The authority of the double crown was not to be tested. Even within the palace walls, the king's mind was seldom at rest. The task of governance brought with it a quieter kind of warfare, a war of records, grain tallies, tax accounts, and the endless petitions of nobles seeking favor. Scribes in white linen worked by the light of oil lamps, their reed pens scratching symbols into rolls of papyrus. Courtiers moved in careful patterns, aware that the wrong word at the wrong time could undo years of influence. Narmer listened, decided, and, when necessary, reminded all present that the ultimate arbiter in the kingdom was not custom, but the will of the king. There were moments, rare but precious, when the weight of the crown seemed lighter. On the terrace overlooking the floodplain, Narmer would watch the sun set over the river, the water turning gold in the fading light. The cries of ibises echoed from the shallows, and the smell of baked mud and fresh-cut grain filled the air. In those moments, he could almost believe that the unity he had fought for was not only real but permanent. But the world beyond the horizon was never still. To the east, across the deserts, shifting alliances in Canaan meant that trade routes could close as swiftly as they opened. To the west, nomadic tribes roamed the edge of the desert, sometimes trading, sometimes raiding. In the south, Nubian chiefs watched Egypt's growing power with a mix of admiration and suspicion. Narmer's name traveled farther than he could, etched on jars and ceilings, a silent envoy of Egypt's reach. But names could be honored or feared, and the line between the two was thin. In the later years of his reign, Narmer turned his attention to ensuring that the unification would survive him. The question of succession was not merely a family matter, it was a matter of state. His queen, believed by some to be the noblewoman Nefertep, played a prominent role in the court, her seal found on official documents and goods. Her presence was a reminder that the women of the royal house could wield influence as guardians of dynastic continuity. The training of their son, Horaha, was not simply about preparing a warrior, but shaping a ruler who understood the delicate balance between the white and red crowns. The rituals of kingship continued to frame Narmer's life. The Hebsed festival, traditionally a renewal of the king's vigor, was anticipated as a grand spectacle, a public affirmation that the pharaoh remained fit to rule. Whether or not Narmer lived to see its full celebration remains uncertain to us now, but in the story of his reign, it serves as a fitting metaphor. The constant renewal of power, the reaffirmation of unity. As the years passed, the memory of the days before unification began to fade from the minds of those who had once fought against it. A new generation grew up knowing only one Egypt, a land bound together by the double crown and the image of the Falcon King. In this way, Narmer's greatest achievement was not the conquest itself, but the creation of a reality in which the idea of division seemed unthinkable. And yet the end came as it must for all rulers. Tradition would later claim that Menez, the name by which some identified Narmer, met his death at the jaws of a hippopotamus, a creature sacred and feared, a symbol of chaos rising from the waters. Whether this was literal truth or allegory, it captured something essential about the life he had lived, that the struggle against disorder was never truly over, that even the mightiest could be pulled beneath the surface in an instant. Narmer was laid to rest at Abydos, in the sacred ground of el-Kab, among the tombs of those who would follow him. His burial was more than a farewell. It was a statement. The Seraph of Narmer, carved into stone and pottery, would endure long after his bones had turned to dust. The palette, the mace head, the seals, all became part of the narrative that transformed a man into the founder of a civilization. For centuries, his name would be spoken with reverence, confusion, and debate. Was Narmer truly Menes, the first pharaoh of Manetho's list? Did he found Memphis, or merely elevate it? The historians of the future would argue, but the people of his time knew one truth. Before Narmer, Egypt was two lands, and after Narmer, it was one. As the desert winds whispered over the sands of Abydos, carrying grains across the stones of his tomb, the legacy of the catfish and the chisel remained. His was a reign that began in blood and ended in myth, a reign that forged the spine of one of the greatest civilizations the world would ever know. And in the long arc of history, Narmer stood not only as the first in a line of pharaohs, but as the man who had dared to imagine that the Nile could flow under a single crown. They called him Lord of the Two Lands, but Narmer knew that two crowns could crush a man's skull as easily as they could adorn it. Unity had been won on the battlefield. Keeping it alive in the hearts of millions was a more complex war, one that could not be fought with maces and spears alone. In the years following the unification, Narmer's life became a measured dance between the needs of his people, the expectations of the gods, and the restless undercurrent of ambition that flowed through his court. The palace in Memphis was the heart of this delicate operation. Its halls were wide and cool, shaded by columns painted with the colors of lotus and papyrus. Here, emissaries from the far reaches of Egypt knelt before the double crown, bearing offerings of grain, fish, wine, and woven cloth. The air smelled of incense and fresh-cut cedar. The floors gleamed where servants had poured water and swept away the dust. Narmer's throne, flanked by the emblems of both crowns, was positioned so that light from the courtyard fell directly upon him, casting his silhouette against a painted wall of falcons in flight. Every audience was staged as carefully as a ritual, the king as axis of the world, uniting the forces of north and south in his very body. But the world beyond the palace did not pause for ceremony. The Delta remained a web of shifting loyalties, and the chiefs who once ruled there still commanded respect in their home districts. Narmer's approach was calculated. He kept their pride intact while binding them into the machinery of the state. Some were married into southern noble families. Others were appointed to prestigious roles in the royal administration, positions that were both honor and leash. The scribes tracked these arrangements meticulously, knowing that alliances, like harvests, could fail if neglected. Religious life became one of Narmer's most potent tools for holding the kingdom together. The gods of the south and the gods of the north were honored side by side in festivals that blended traditions. The vulture goddess Nekbet of Upper Egypt and the cobra goddess Wadjet of Lower Egypt appeared together on temple walls, their wings and coils framing the pharaoh's name. By placing himself at the center of these divine pairings, Narmer was not simply a ruler. He was the living thread between pantheons, the guarantor that the blessings of both lands would flow through him. Each year, as the Nile's floodwaters began to rise, Narmer led processions along the riverbanks. Barges draped in linen carried statues of the gods, their faces gilded, their eyes inlaid with polished stone that caught the sunlight. Priests chanted hymns, their voices carrying across the water. Farmers left their fields to line the banks, offering baskets of bread and jars of beer. Children were lifted onto shoulders to see the king pass, his figure gleaming in white and red, the double crown balanced on his head. These journeys were more than spectacle. They were reminders that the same water nourished every village, every field, from the first cataract in the south to the salt marshes in the north. Yet unity was always under threat, sometimes from forces far beyond the kingdom's borders. Reports reached Memphis of unrest in the Sinai, where Egypt's miners and traders clashed with local tribes. The turquoise and copper from these lands were vital to the kingdom's wealth and ritual life, feeding the artisans who adorned temples and palaces. Narmer ordered expeditions to secure the mines, sending soldiers and overseers to reassert control. In Canaan, the political landscape shifted as new settlements rose, their rulers watching Egypt's power with wary eyes. Narmer's merchants and envoys carried goods and messages along these trade routes, but always under the shadow of potential conflict. To the south, Nubia's rich lands and gold-filled deserts tempted every pharaoh. Narmer understood the value of both friendship and dominance in this region. His forces patrolled the southern borders, ensuring that Egypt's influence was felt, but he also sent gifts and envoys, weaving a relationship that allowed for mutual benefit. Nubian archers, famed for their skill, were sometimes recruited into Egypt's armies, their loyalty secured by the promise of shared spoils and royal favor. Inside Egypt, the challenge shifted from conquest to maintenance. Granaries were stocked against years of poor flood, canals were dug to channel water into dry fields, and workshops turned out tools, weapons, and luxury goods. Narmer's reign saw the refinement of administrative systems that would become hallmarks of pharaonic rule. Records kept on papyrus, sealings used to secure goods, officials appointed to oversee every aspect of daily life. These measures were not simply practical, they were the invisible architecture of unity, the threads that held the two lands together when distance and difference might otherwise tear them apart. The king's image remained central to this system. Wherever goods were stored or shipped, his sirek appeared, carved or stamped, an emblem of authority that traveled farther than he could. In temples, his likeness stood beside the gods, sometimes even the same size, a visual declaration that his presence was as constant as the Nile itself. The Narmer palette and mace head, kept in sacred treasuries, were brought out on special occasions, their carvings a reminder of the victories that had made the present peace possible. Years of stability allowed Narmer to dream beyond survival. Building projects expanded, temples rose in both Upper and Lower Egypt, shrines were repaired, and monumental gateways carved with scenes of the king's triumphs. In Memphis, construction began on more permanent structures, foundations of stone meant to outlast the reigns of those who built them. The idea was clear. Egypt would not only be united in his lifetime, but it would bear the stamp of his rule for generations to come. Still, Narmer was not immune to the burdens of time. The vigor of his youth, when he had stood knee-deep in the marshes to strike down his enemies, was tempered now by the weight of governance and the aches of age. He spent more hours in council than on campaign, more days hearing petitions than leading armies. Yet his mind remained sharp, and his understanding of the kingdom's fragile balance deepened. The double crown was not a trophy to be worn, but a responsibility to be carried. In private moments, Narmer contemplated the legacy he would leave. His son, Horaha, was already taking on greater duties, representing the crown at ceremonies and leading minor expeditions. The young prince's confidence was a source of pride, but Narmer knew that inheriting a united Egypt would not guarantee keeping it. He began to shape the court's perception of Horah, ensuring that loyalty to the father would flow naturally to the son. Allies were reminded of their debt to the royal house. Rivals were offered positions that kept them close and under watch. The Nile continued its eternal rhythm, but Narmer felt the passing of seasons more keenly. The festivals he had once led with boundless energy became occasions for careful pacing. The rituals, no less grand, but adjusted to the limits of his endurance. Still, he refused to let the people see weakness. In public, he appeared as the embodiment of the two lands' strength, the man who had turned rivers of blood into rivers of grain, who had taken two crowns and made them one. It was during one such festival, as the people celebrated the bounty of the harvest, that omens were whispered among the priests. The river had brought abundance, yet a great hippopotamus had been seen near the royal hunting grounds, a creature sacred to some gods, but also a symbol of untamed chaos. The story of Menes's death at the jaws of such a beast would one day be told, though whether it was prophecy or invention, no one could say. For Narmer, it was a reminder that the forces he had spent his life mastering could never be fully controlled. The later years of Narmer's reign were marked by a quiet consolidation of power, the smoothing of tensions that once threatened to split the kingdom apart. His name became synonymous with stability, his reign a reference point for those who would follow. Yet he knew that even the strongest walls could crumble if the foundations were neglected. In his final seasons, he turned his attention to reinforcing those foundations, training administrators, strengthening religious ties, and leaving behind a system that could endure beyond his life. When the end came, it was as sudden as the turning of the Nile's current. The details would be lost to history, wrapped in layers of legend and reverence. Some said the king was taken by the river itself, swallowed by the chaos he had held at bay. Others claimed he died in Memphis, surrounded by his family and court. His body carried south to be buried among the first kings at Abydos. What mattered was not the manner of his passing, but the world he left behind. Egypt remained united, its people bound by a shared identity that had been forged in the vision of one man. Narmer's tomb at el-Kab was modest compared to the pyramids that would rise in later centuries, but it held the power of beginnings. Here lay the man whose Seraph had crossed from the south to the north, whose double crown had set the pattern for every pharaoh to come. In the darkness of the burial chamber, surrounded by offerings and the symbols of his reign, Narmer joined the ancestors, his name carved into the memory of a civilization that would endure for 3,000 years. The burial rites for Narmer were carried out with the precision of a ceremony repeated for generations, though in truth, no king before him had been honored in quite the same way. His body was wrapped in fine linen, woven in the looms of both Upper and Lower Egypt. The fabric dyed with plant pigments that spoke of the colors of the two lands, the deep white of the southern crown, the rich red of the northern. Golden amulets shaped like the falcon of Horus were placed over his chest and brow, their wings outstretched in protection. Priests chanted hymns that told of his victories, of the day he struck down the enemy in the marshes, of the moment he wore the double crown for the first time. The air in the burial chamber was thick with incense, a blend of frankincense from Punt and myrrh from the south. Scents meant to please the gods and carry the king's spirit safely into the afterlife. The tomb itself, built in the sacred necropolis of el-Kab at Abydos, consisted of two adjacent chambers, each lined with mud brick walls reinforced with timber. One chamber held the king's body and offerings of food, drink, and ritual objects. The other contained goods for his journey into eternity, ceremonial mace heads, carved vessels, and the seal impressions of his reign. Around the tomb, smaller graves were dug for retainers who would follow him in death, a practice that reflected the belief that the king's household should accompany him into the next world, just as it had served him in life. Above the entrance, the Seraph of Narmer was carved into stone, the falcon of Horus watching over it, a symbol that would remain long after the body beneath had turned to dust. As the burial procession withdrew from the desert edge, the people of Egypt returned to their lives along the Nile's green banks. Yet the absence of Narmer was a palpable thing, like the shadow cast by a mountain suddenly gone. The unity he had forged was now in the hands of his heir, Horah, and the system of governance Narmer had so carefully built. In the early days of the new reign, the court made every effort to preserve continuity. Festivals were held in Narmer's honor, and his deeds were recited as if they were the deeds of the gods themselves. The double crown passed smoothly to the new king, its symbolism intact, its power undiminished, at least for the moment. In the memory of his people, Narmer's reign was not merely the beginning of the First Dynasty, it was the beginning of Egypt as a singular entity, a concept that would shape the nation's identity for millennia. His achievements were told and retold in the marketplaces and temple courtyards, how he had taken the land of the papyrus and the land of the lotus and bound them together, how he had raised the walls of Memphis and made it the heart of the kingdom, how he had extended Egypt's reach into foreign lands, ensuring that the name of the Pharaoh was known beyond the desert's edge. These stories were both history and myth, blending truth with the embellishments that time always weaves into memory. The artifacts of his reign continued to speak for him long after his voice was gone. The Narmer palette, with its vivid scenes of conquest and unity, became a sacred object, its images copied and reinterpreted by later rulers. The mace head, the seal impressions, the carved vessels, all served as silent witnesses to a life spent balancing the demands of war and peace, tradition and innovation. In the centuries to come, scribes would argue over the identity of Menes. The name recorded in the king lists as the founder of the First Dynasty. Was Menes Narmer himself, or was he Horaha, or perhaps a composite figure born of memory and political need? The debate would never be settled, but for the people of Narmer's time, the question did not matter. They knew who had brought unity, and they honored him for it. In the broader sweep of history, Narmer's reign marked the end of Egypt's prehistoric age and the dawn of its dynastic era. The political and cultural structures he established would form the backbone of pharaonic civilization. The centralization of authority, the integration of regional deities into a unified pantheon, the expansion of trade networks, and the codification of royal imagery, all these were legacies of his time on the throne. Even the concept of the pharaoh as a divine intermediary between gods and men, the living embodiment of Ma'at, was shaped and strengthened under his rule. Generations later, when the pyramids rose on the Giza Plateau and Egypt's golden age of monumental building unfolded, the rulers who commissioned those works did so in the shadow of Narmer's example. They inherited a kingdom already bound together by a shared identity, already accustomed to the idea that a single man could embody the will of the gods and the fate of the land. In this sense, Narmer's influence stretched far beyond his own lifetime, reaching into every era of Egypt's long history. Yet his story also carried a warning. The unity he achieved was not inevitable, nor was it indestructible. It had been built through vision, force, and the careful management of rival interests, and it required constant vigilance to maintain. The kings who followed would face their own challenges, rebellions, foreign invasions, natural disasters that would test the strength of the foundations Narmer had laid. Some would fail, and the land would fracture. Others would succeed, and Egypt would flourish anew. In each case, the memory of the man who had first bound the two lands together would serve as both inspiration and challenge. In the quiet hours of the night, when the winds swept across the desert and rattled the reeds along the riverbanks, those who kept the old stories would speak of Narmer in almost supernatural terms. They would say that the falcon of Horus still circled above his tomb, guarding the spirit of the first king. They would say that the Nile's floods were a sign of his continued favor, that when the river rose high and the fields grew fat with grain, it was because Narmer still watched over his people from the realm of the gods. The truth, as always, was more complex. Narmer was a man, ambitious, calculating, relentless. But he was also the product of his time, a figure who understood better than any before him that symbols could outlast swords. His mastery of imagery, ceremony, in political theater was as important to his success as his skill in battle. He had taken the raw materials of a divided land and shaped them into something new, something that would endure for centuries. And in doing so, he had become more than a man in the eyes of those he ruled. He had become a legend. As the centuries passed, the desert would reclaim many of the places where Narmer had walked. Cities would rise and fall, temples would crumble, and the Nile would shift its course. But in the sacred ground of Abydos, the Seraph of Narmer would remain, carved into stone, a reminder of the moment when Egypt became one. For the people who trace their lineage back to that moment, whether they lived in the shadow of the pyramids or in the far reaches of the Delta, the name of Narmer was the beginning of their story. And as long as the Nile flowed, that story would be told, of the catfish and the chisel, the man who wore two crowns, and the dream of unity that still ran, like the river itself, through the heart of Egypt.